exciting chapter you'd like to be a part of? Just remember, you'll need about 5 hours to keep your natural self.
Welcome back, Screen Crush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things that you might have missed in the first episode of Moon Knight.
Man, what is going on in this show? It's very confusing.
Well, I'll explain what's going on, but first, let's break down a few Easter eggs. The series opens to Bob Dylan's Every Grain of Sand. Now, Bob Dylan is a born-again Christian, and this is one of his most spiritual songs. The lyrics talk about hitting his low point, what he calls the moment of confession, when he can see the Master's hand in all of nature and in every grain of sand. And this has a lot of meanings for Moon Knight, and especially for the villain Arthur Harrow. In the comics, Moon Knight was a mercenary named Marc who died in the desert and was resurrected by Khonshu, the Egyptian god of the moon. This was Marc's low point, his moment of confession, when he had a religious conversion to serve Khonshu. Much like Saul in the Bible was struck blind by God and became the apostle named Paul. The show seems like it's going to be about faith in gods and serving their will. For instance, look what Harrow does in this very first scene. He conducts a kind of ceremony on himself. He uses this glass of water to make a chime. Now, this is similar to Eastern meditation techniques where chimes are used to harmonize the soul. In some parts of the world, this sound can mean good luck or prosperity, or it can be a warning that evil is nearby. In Christianity, water is also a symbol of purity, meant to cleanse. There's holy water and the baptism. And the breaking of a glass in a towel is reminiscent of a Jewish wedding tradition that symbolizes the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Even though the couple is starting their new journey together, they must still reflect on what has been lost. Broken glass has evolved over time to become a symbol of hope and renewal.
But then why does he put the glass in his shoes?
Well, this is where it all ties together. This is reminiscent of fire walking, the ritual where one walks across hot coals. This is a way to show your faith. It's a rite of passage to show your devotion to the gods. By walking on shattered glass, Harrow is demonstrating to his god, Ammit, that he will endure any trial for her benefit. And don't worry, we're going to explain all the Egyptian god stuff and their symbolism later in the video. And then we shift. And we meet Stephen Grant, set to the tune of A Man Without Love by Humperdinck.
I'm not listening.
No, Engelbert Humperdinck. Now, this song's meaning is more obvious. Stephen's condition keeps him from being with anyone, so he is lonely, a man without love.
So what's going on with Stephen? Why is he chaining himself to his bed and stuff?
Well, actually, we have a video coming out tomorrow that explains this in way more detail. But basically, Stephen suffers from what's called dissociative identity disorder, or DID, what's commonly called multiple personality disorder. In the comics, Moon Knight was a former mercenary named Marc who pledged to serve Khonshu, the Egyptian god of the moon. To do this, he created new identities: a playboy named Stephen Grant, a cab driver named Jake Lockley, and the hero Moon Knight, and later another masked hero called Mr. Knight. Now, these identities also reflect the many phases of the moon. Just as in Egyptian lore, Khonshu has 4 different aspects: traveler, embracer, pathfinder, and defender.
What, Khonshu? Like in Night at the Museum?
Yes, the tablet in Night at the Museum that brought everything to life was powered by Khonshu's moon power. So, if this show ends up linking the Night at the Museum trilogy to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, remember that Lords Doug and Ryan predicted it first. And you have to call me Lord because I recently acquired 1 square foot of land in Scotland, which technically makes me a Scottish landowner. And, according to Scottish custom, this allows me to have the title of Lord or Lady.
Oh, did you buy a castle or something?
No, I purchased 1 square foot of land through a company called Established Titles. They're the sponsor of this video. My land is on a private nature reserve in Ardelay, Aberdeenshire, and my purchase also helps preserve their woodlands. And that's the cool thing about this certification. It's not just a novelty gift, it helps protect the woodlands of Scotland. With every order, Established Titles plants trees all over the world through their charity partners, One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. You get this certificate with an official crest and a unique plot number so you can see the exact location of your land. Then you're going to be allowed to officially change your name to Lord or Lady, and you can even have this on your credit cards or plane tickets. It also makes for a terrific last-minute gift. I mean, just look at some of these reactions.
Lord Joe Green.
Yes!
Lord Kenneth Delane Albert.
All right. Hey, look at that. You will be calling me Lord!
This is a really fun present, very touching, and also very affordable. Right now, Established Titles is running a big sale, and if you use the code ScreenCrush, you get an additional 10% off any purchase. So go to establishedtitles.com/ScreenCrush to get your discount now. Back to the Easter eggs. Now, in the comics, Marc trying to maintain all of his various identities led him to develop DID. Or he had it all along, or it was created by Khonshu being in his brain. The details are left murky on purpose. But Point is, Stephen has no idea that he has DID. He wakes up in strange places and probably assumes that he's been kidnapped. So he uses tape to create a seal on the door, sand to catch any footprints, and a combination lock to keep him in his bed. In the comics, Stephen is a fake identity used to finance Moon Knight's activities. Here, it seems like the Stephen identity is used for cover. He calls his mother's voicemail twice and gets postcards from her. And I think these cards are actually sent from Marc as a way to make Stephen think that he has lived a normal life. In fact, there is a clue that this is the case. Stephen's work sells many of the same postcards that his mother sends him. And then we get the newest member of the Pet Avengers, Gus the Fish. Now notice that Stephen, an expert in Egyptian history, has decorated the aquarium with Egyptian artifacts that are linked to the afterlife. There's the entrance to a tomb, a pyramid where the pharaohs were buried, and also a funeral boat. This boat symbolizes the transport of a dead person's soul moving to the afterlife. They would sail the boat across the Nile to transport the pharaoh's body to be mummified. Again, remember that Marc died in Egypt and Khonshu resurrected him, so we have a lot of hints about the afterlife in this show. He describes mummification to a kid.
This big metal hook, right? And you'd go up the old nozzle and all the organs would come out except for the heart.
And later he even says,
well, that don't make sense, because I'm not dead, am I?
As he approaches the museum, we see it reflected in a puddle, one of many reflections in this episode to show his fractured psyche, and I'll point them out as I go along. And there's also the way that the guard at the front always says his name wrong.
JB.
Nice guy. Yeah, mate.
Scott. Stephen.
Also, Marc came in and scored a date with this lady.
Still on for 7 tomorrow?
7 tomorrow.
Best steak in town?
There are lots of other references to Egyptian gods throughout the episode, and I'm wondering if we're actually going to see some of them down the road. In the gift shop, the plush toys on the counter are of Tararet, the goddess of fertility and childbirth. She's a hippo but walks on 2 legs. She was also known for cleansing souls and preparing them for the afterlife. And also, we see Hera weighing the value of each person's soul before sending them into the great beyond. Stephen also mentions the Ennead, calling them
The supergroup of Egyptian gods.
which, I guess is a good way to put it. The word Ennead stems from Greek. It means 9. And this was only one of the pantheons in Egyptian mythology. Cultists would worship different groups and their beliefs would sometimes clash. Like this group that Hera leads. It's a modern day Egyptian cult that worships Ammit, but more on her in a bit. Now, when he leaves the museum, the song playing is a cover of Arab Trap made in Egypt by DJ Kaboo. And this contains a sample of the song Kusara that you've probably heard before. Including a song within a song that's covering another song is another way of expressing Marc's DID. In the square, Stevie speaks to a captive audience, a living statue, who actually looks a lot like his informant Crawley from the comics. It's appropriate that his only friend is a statue, because in the comics, Marc communicates with Khonshu through a statue of the god. And as he leaves, we have another reflection down in the water. To keep himself awake at night, he uses a Rubik's Cube puzzle, which my wife pointed out has many faces, just like Moon Knight. Each color of the cube is intermeshed and overlapping with the other, just like his identities are becoming intertwined. Throughout the series, he'll have to solve the mystery of his identity, just like a Rubik's Cube. Then when he finally falls asleep, he wakes up in Germany with his jaw out of place.
Go back to sleep, worm.
Hello?
You're not supposed to be here.
Yep, I completely agree.
And that was the voice of F. Murray Abrams as the voice of Khonshu, like a more serious Venom.
Tomatoes, potatoes, tomatoes, tomatoes, tomatoes.
So what's happened here is that Marc was using their body to go on a mission for Khonshu. My guess is that he was knocked out, which brought back Stephen. Then he finds that he's holding a scarab beetle. Now these were sacred to Egyptians, and they would use them for amulets and creating seals that would be on letters. I have a theory about this scarab that I'm going to go into later on. Now to make sure he's not recognized, he does that MCU trick of putting on a hoodie.
Relax, no one's gonna recognize us.
What, because of hats and sunglasses? It's not a disguise, Hank. We look like ourselves at a baseball game.
The hood is also white, just like the costume of Moon Knight, showing that that persona is under the surface, waiting to get out. Then he comes across Arthur Harrow's Ammit cult. Now, it's appropriate that he's in Germany because in the comics, Arthur was a German scientist who was suspected of continuing experiments that were first conducted at Auschwitz. He says,
I judge you in Ammit's name with but a fraction of her power.
So, in Egyptian mythology, Ammit is known as the devourer of the dead. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, would weigh a person's heart measured against a feather from Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If they were deemed impure, then Ammit would eat them. This is why earlier the writers had Stephen mention that the Egyptians kept their heart in the body after embalming.
All the organs would come out except for the heart.
How come?
Because they believed you needed your heart to be judged in the underworld.
If the person had a decent life, the heart balanced with or lighter than the feather, and the person was rendered worthy to live forever in paradise with Osiris. If not, then Ammit would eat your heart and your soul would be restless forever. She also had the head of a crocodile, just like the top of Hero's cane, and the front legs of a lion and the back legs of a hindquarters of a hippo. Later on, we hear that she was essentially banished from the earth, allowing the wicked to live without fear. I'm wondering how this is going to relate to Khonshu and the great rift between the gods and humankind. At some point, the people turned away from the gods, but cultists like Harrow and Moon Knight are once again giving these Egyptian gods power in the real world. I'm also wondering if the event that pulled the humans away from the gods was the emergence of an all-powerful pharaoh named Apocalypse, and because he was an all-powerful mutant god who walked among them, the people turned to him and worshipped him instead. X-Men connections. Notice the scales look like crocodile mouths, a way to symbolize that she is eating the souls of the unworthy. Now notice that Khonshu does not allow him to return the scarab.
Take it. That's so strange. Sorry about that.
In the comics, it's later revealed that Khonshu actually has entered Marc's head and was the cause of his split personalities, and that this was his plan to weaken Marc and take control of his body. Then, during the cupcake car chase, the song playing is Wake Me Up Before You Go Go by WHAM.
Wake me up before you go go.
This is an inspired needle drop. The song's obvious meaning is that Steven is trying to wake up from what he thinks is a dream, and that Khonshu wants Marc to wake up and take over for Steve. But the lyrics of the song hold a deeper meaning. My best friend told me what you did last night. You left me sleeping in my bed. I was dreaming, but I should have been with you instead.
Wake me up before you go go.
Calm down. Think about how this song's lyrics match up with what Steven and Marc are going through. Marc is going off and having these adventures without Steven, leaving him to think that he's just lying in their bed. The series is about Steven wanting to be a part of this life, well, or at least to be rid of it. It's also interesting that he blacks out in the moments where it seems like all is lost, almost like Steven is seeing himself dying and is repeatedly resurrected, just like how in the comics, Marc is constantly resurrected by Khonshu. And then, back to normal. He wakes up to the same song in his bed, now seeing multiple reflections of himself to reflect the new identities that he's just encountered, Marc and Khonshu. At first, Steven thinks this was all a dream before we get to the fish.
Yesterday, that fish had one fin, yeah? You would like that when I bought him. Today, what do you see?
I see two.
2 fins!
Now what we have here is a classic situational comedy situation where a character loses or causes the death of another character's pet, and then that character has to go try to find a replacement. We call it Meet the Parent Syndrome.
Hello, Jinx. Attaboy.
Now this supports the theory that Marc, or maybe even another identity, is living out Steven's life while he's asleep in their subconscious. Next, Steven gets ready for his date, first looking in a single mirror, but then pivoting to look in a three-way vanity. Just as when the series starts, he thinks that he is one person, but gradually comes to meet and understand his other two identities. And look, the MCU is littered with tragedy. Characters have lost their families, killed their families, been orphaned. But what happens to Steven here is more tragic than any of those events. More tragic than the snap. He loses his weekend.
What day is it today?
Sunday, sir.
I did think that it was interesting that the scene ends with him ordering a steak, because earlier he says he's a vegan, or maybe his other self is a vegan and he's actually the person who eats steak. I don't have any theories here, I just want to flag that so I can refer back to it in another episode. And I want to quickly talk about the items on his bulletin board by the door. There's a topographical map, Egyptian hieroglyphics, a palace or temple right here with columns. There's also this picture of a lake with a tree behind it. In Egyptian mythology, Ammit would sometimes sit by a lake of fire, waiting in the spot where the hearts of the unworthy were thrown for her to devour. Now these are all definitely items that Marc would use in his life as a mercenary, or more likely, Khonshu has ordered Marc to stop Ammit from returning, so he's trying to track down the headquarters of these cultists. Steven discovers Marc's stash spot, which is shaped like a pyramid because, in many ways, Marc's life is being resurrected here in this spot. He has an old flip phone, the kind before all cells included a GPS, and he has missed calls from Layla. Now, I'm going to guess that this is the show's version of Marlene, his partner from the comics. Also, this line,
Why did you call me Marc?
is taken straight from the brilliant Jeff Lemire run when he's shifting back and forth between his personalities. There's another missed call from Duchamp, the last name of his gadget guy from the comics, Frenchie. Now, in the books, Moon Knight doesn't always have supernatural powers. He starts off more like Batman, a rich guy with multiple identities who has moon-themed gadgets and planes. Frenchie was the guy who built these gadgets for him. So, I mentioned earlier that in the comics, Steven was an identity created by Marc. It looks like the same thing has happened here. Marc needed to lay low under another name, but then he developed DID and his pseudonym became real. But we're going to explain that in way more detail in tomorrow's video. Subscribe, hit the bell, make sure you don't miss it. This conversation with Layla is the first time he hears his alter's name.
Why did you call me Marc?
And then Marc speaks to him directly through a circular mirror that is shaped like a full moon. Again, this is because his identities come and go like phases of the moon. You can even see the reflection move slightly differently than Steven does, because for a moment, Marc takes control of the body while Steven watches. When he runs in the elevator, there's a flaming skull sticker here, maybe a nod to the eventual return of Ghost Rider. We do have a video coming out soon about the Midnight Suns. That's a supernatural team that could feature Moon Knight, Blade, your mom, and the Black Knight. The mirrors in the elevator form an infinity effect, a method often used to show that there are many facets to a character's mind. But also, in this shot, we're meant to think that we're looking at Steven, but we're actually looking at a reflection. In the same way, Steven is a reflection of the original identity, Marc Spector. Then we get our first full look at Khonshu, drawn straight from the comic pages of the brilliant 2014 Warren Ellis Moon Knight run. He looks like a mummified bird person with a beak and a scepter. Now, in addition to being the god of the moon, Khonshu is also the god of vengeance and of travelers, because the moon travels across the sky. And here we have another reflection of Steven on the bus just before he sees Harrow, a way of saying that Harrow is a kind of reflection of Steven. They both serve ancient Egyptian gods. In the museum, Harrow confronts Steven and gives us a little background on Ammit.
But she was betrayed by indolent fellow gods, by even her own avatar.
So Moon Knight is an avatar of Khonshu. That means that Moon Knight is a representative of the god on Earth. He's the receptacle of his power. Now, I don't know if we'll learn the full history of Ammit's avatar's betrayal in this series, but it does seem likely that Harrow will transform into some kind of new avatar and be even more empowered to have a big CGI fight with Moon Knight. And here's a fun theory. Maybe Harrow can actually hear the voice of Ammit in his head the same way Steven hears Khonshu. Also, the use of the word avatar creates some amusing confusion.
Blue people love that film.
Referring to the Disney-owned property Avatar, and
you mean that? I mean anime.
Referring to Avatar: The Last Airbender, even though it's not technically anime because it was made by an American studio. Harrow points out all the good that Ammit would have done by stopping real-life events like the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide, the rise of Pol Pot, and Nero. Nero is an interesting choice because he was a Roman emperor who compared himself to the sun god Sol. So when he measures Steven, notice how the scales shake and they don't know what to make of him. And Harrow says,
"There's chaos in you."
I think the reason the scales don't work is because they are weighing the multiple personalities at once. Maybe Steven is good, but Marc is bad, and there's chaos in him because these personalities are at war with one another. Now, in the museum, Steven hears the howl of a jackal, and the jackal is the symbol of Anubis, the god of death. And later, of course, he is attacked by an avatar of Anubis, this giant jackal that Moon Knight beats to death. Then we see this stuffed alligator start to move, and remember, Ammit had the head of an alligator. This could also be a reference to Sobek, a protective god. The statue behind him here is of Horus. This is the god of the sky who actually had the moon as his left eye, making Khonshu an aspect of Horus. Now this appears to be a statue of two baboons which were sacred in Egypt. They were associated with the god Thoth, who was also a god of the moon. And here we see Steven's reflections move independently from him, again reflecting the three different aspects of his mind. He retreats into the bathroom where we see more hieroglyphics. This one appears to be Khonshu, and this one looks like Horus. Finally, Marc and Steven come face to face. Now, using mirrors for altars to speak to one another has been done in many movies, very famously in The Two Towers.
Smeagol losing his nerve. No, not.
And also, this whole scenario might remind a lot of you of Fight Club. In that movie, the narrator creates a protective personality to channel all the emotions that he can't allow himself to feel. Emotions like rage, lust, and pain. Now, what's interesting in this show is that Marc is not the protector persona. Moon Knight is. I'm wondering if this is maybe the first time Moon Knight is able to take his full form, because Steven possesses the scarab. Like maybe Moon Knight somehow combines the different aspects of Marc's mind into one mystical being.
Like Captain Planet?
Yes, like Captain Planet, but with magic.
Captain Planet is magic.
Yes, Captain Planet's magic. Oh, by the way, I love the new Moon Knight uniform design. The mummy bandages tie him to the afterlife and give him this horror monster movie kind of feel. Let me know your thoughts on the uniform down in the comics. Now, there's also a few things that I want to point out in the credits. There's the reflection of Big Ben and the Thames, a way to say that Stephen the Englishman is just a reflection of another self, Marc Spector. Now notice how the moon frames the tip of a pyramid, much like the Eye of Providence, a symbol that means divinity. We see a photo of Marc and Layla, played by May Calloway, followed by a wedding ring, so I'm guessing that they're married. Here they're in Egypt, which could be a nod to how Marc and Marlene met in the comics. Then there are these multiple reflected selves, followed by a bullet hole in glass, which also creates multiple shattered reflections. Maybe this is referring to Marc's death, which led to his resurrection with multiple personalities. Then we see the moon splitting, further symbolizing his fractured mind. Well, that's all the Easter eggs that we found, but if you found any, let me know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe and smash that bell. For Screen Crush, I'm Ryan Airy.